when you have upper motor neuron disease like a stroke, you get downstream changes in the mechanics of your body that are uncontrollable. So even though our objective was to build better robotic limbs, what we needed to do first was understand how the human body controls its mechanical properties.
Dr. Elliott Rouse is an associate professor in the departments of robotics and mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan, where he directs the neurobionics lab.
Can you explain the engineering challenges of making stiffness both controllable and also energy efficient in such a compatible device?
So it's just a machine design challenge, but we overcame that challenge, did the math to make that work. We developed the mechanism that can change its support location, working on a second generation version of this prosthesis that can change its stiffness from step to step.
What were the hardest control challenges you faced in creating a modular prosthetics that works across different geared styles?
That is a great question. And maybe your question was like, what was the hardest thing?
Yeah.
But let me flip that and answer. Well,
Alright, so about 25% of you guys that watch our video say they've not even subscribed. So if you are watching this video, please do that. This is a little way of showing our support to supporting the team, people who are editing the videos, who are working here with us to make things possible. We build a community, like probably the biggest tech community in Africa, connecting CEOs, top CEOs, best engineers from around the world. So we're doing our best to make sure we provide quality content. So, but you can only push us forward by just subscribing to the channel, and that will mean a lot to us. Thank you. All right. So good day, Professor Rose. It's a very good pleasure to have you on this podcast, and I'm truly honored to have you because initially I reached out because of your contribution in prosthetics technology as the director of neurobionics lab at University of Michigan. So, and according to your research, we saw that it uncovers some key insights into joint mechanical impedance during walking. So what have been the most surprising discoveries about how stiffness and damping shape human locomotion?
yes, that was a great question and very much in my wheelhouse. This is an area of research that started when I was a grad student. And so in 2009, when this kind of research began, we were just beginning to think about robotic prostheses and how should they behave. So we looked at the human body. We went to the literature and we looked up, what are the biomechanics of human gait, and particularly the powered sort of mechanical impedance properties, which would be relevant in a powered system. And there wasn't anything. So that literature did not exist. And so that actually was the first thing we started with. So even though our objective was to build better robotic limbs, what we needed to do first was understand how the human body controls its mechanical properties. And the properties we were looking at were the kind of torque, so effort, displacement or velocity, and then also stiffness. So how stiff it is, whether I'm co-contracting of my two muscles. And that stiffness property is or had not been measured, at all during the 100 years of biomechanics. So we began measuring it, and that's become a core part of my research group. And we are measuring the stiffness and damping properties of the joints of the legs during gait, which is something that had never been measured. And what that forms is the instructions for powered robots that want to replicate the functions of human gait, so the biomechanics of human gait. So that's where that research began, and kind of started by highlighting that gap in the literature and our understanding. And then we're still working on today, but it serves as we do fundamental studies of human gait, and that serves as the instructions for robotic prostheses. And that's an active area of research. We've taken that also into looking at how those properties, mechanical impedance properties or joint stiffness and damping, how that changes following a stroke. So that when you have upper motor neuron disease like a stroke, you get downstream changes in the mechanics of your body that are uncontrollable. And the way we would talk about those in engineering is through mechanical impedance properties like stiffness and damping. But the way they talk about it in the clinic is very different. They use words like spasticity or contracture. So we're kind of also using these topics to build this link between the engineering world of describing the mechanics of the body and the clinical world of assessing the mechanics of the body and understanding disease. So that's our current kind of one area of research that we're working on. It's really an exciting area, and it's a challenging area of research. So they're really hard studies to run. That's one reason why there were, that the studies had existed is they're very challenging. So we've overcome those challenges, and it's a really fun.
Thank you so much, Professor. So you said something about clinic. So can you expatiate more about how is it different from what is being said in clinic than the implementation in robotics?
Yeah, so I guess there's two answers to that. One on the prosthetic side, maybe, and one on the stroke or post-stroke side. So on the prosthetic side, existing prostheses, as I'm sure you know, are mostly passive, so they don't have motors, they can't produce their own energy. They store and release energy as springs. And so that's the current state of the art. They're carbon fiber blade-like springs. Their mechanics are governed by their shape, and we kind of converged on them as a field because they're foot-shaped springs, and they do store and return energy. They're very light, and they're easily mass manufactured. But they're the wrong mechanics. They're passive. They're not like our human body. So the entire prosthetics world generally focused on this passive spring concept, up until very recently in the last decade or two. And that opened up these questions of, okay, if we replace these passive systems with motors and batteries more like our muscles, what should these systems do? And we're one of several groups, or many groups, kind of looking at that, trying to understand what should they do. Now that we have these additional capabilities of powered systems, like what are the right properties for limbs that you strap to your body, machines. And then the other side of that is kind of on the clinical side of post-stroke. So these are the joint impedance properties change following the stroke. And if let's say someone has a stroke, they would oftentimes have changes to their ability to walk. They have motion coupling. So, there's certain flexion patterns that their body would naturally go into that they wouldn't be able to not do. And those changes could all be described as changes to the mechanical impedance properties if you're talking in the engineering world. If you're talking in the clinical world, it has a totally different vocabulary. And that's just a little bit of the challenge, is that the clinical world kind of came up through gait observation, not through physics-based understanding of the body. So they're just two separate paths of understanding kind of what goes wrong when somebody has a stroke. And we're trying to bridge that gap to form this link between the clinical worries and observations and challenges that people have. So if your joints are very stiff, it can be very difficult to walk. It can be very difficult to store and return energy and walk efficiently. So we're building this bridge between the kind of clinical world of observation and biomechanics, gait analysis, to engineering and physics-based information like stiffness stamping, the properties themselves, and how to quantify them and assess them. And it's just a kind of a very different way of looking at it. And we have a long way to go before, what we would love is that this is a different tool for clinicians to use, and that the measurements we do could someday be in the clinic and take the place of the qualitative methods that are used today. And instead they would use the quantitative methods that we develop. We're still making the methods more amenable to the clinic. Right now they take many trials. You need a gait laboratory. So right now it's not an easy thing to do in the clinic. So we have our work cut out for us in the future to streamline that. But first we have to understand the relevance of these properties.
Okay, so why the variable stiffness prosthetics foot adapt, like the variable stiffness prosthetics to foot adapts continuously during walking? So can you explain the engineering challenges of making stiffness both controllable and also energy efficient in such a compatible device?
Yes, that's a great question. And that gets to kind of the crux of that invention. So now we're talking, instead of talking about a fully powered system, like a motor and a battery that provides energy like our muscles, another idea is to make a system, instead of just being a spring, fully passive, we can kind of strike a balance between powered and passive by something called quasi-passive. And this is what that variable stiffness prosthetic foot is, the VISPA foot. So it uses a small motor and battery to reconfigure the passive properties. So it's still passive. It can't add any net positive energy to you. It can store and return energy well, and it can change the stiffness or spring properties during the step. and between steps. So that property hasn't been possible in prostheses, certainly not passive prostheses to date. They're either these powered systems that are big and heavy, or they're these passive systems that are small and light. And we haven't had anything in between there. And so the VispaFoot is kind of between those. So it's passive, but uses a powered system to reconfigure its properties. So the reason there aren't any quasi-passive, or really there are variable damping systems, even commercially available. So prostheses that will change their loss properties, their viscosity during the step, that exists, but not variable stiffness. That's very difficult. It's very difficult to get a compact mechanism that can change its stiffness, that's both efficient and adjustable during or between steps. So mostly that was a kind of a machine design packaging issue. The loads in those mechanisms are extremely high, thousands and thousands of newtons. So it's just a machine design challenge, but we overcame that challenge. So we developed essentially a very compact way to vary the stiffness of a spring. And it's very much like a diving board, where you can change the fulcrum of a diving board, or we could change the stiffness of this endpoint of that spring. And then we map the mechanics of that spring to the mechanics of the ankle joint using a cam-based transmission. And so we did the math to make that work. And we developed the mechanism that can change its support location. And we built this prosthesis that can change its stiffness from step to step. And now we built an orthosis that can do the same thing. And we're working on a second generation version of this prosthesis that can change its stiffness from step to step. That's more amenable to commercialization. So it's smaller and can be packaged into a smaller shape, so a foot shell can go on it. The existing version of this foot is long, has this long spring. We move the fulcrum beneath that spring, so it has two parallel plates or planes, and those planes need to be maintained. They're parallel, their distance, that all needs to be maintained in that mechanism. And that's not good. That's challenging. So we've come up with a new design that doesn't use these parallel planes and sliding fulcrums. So we're moving away from that because it makes the mechanism big and unlikely to fit in a foot shell. But the good part about that is we were able to develop a compact variable stiffness foot, and that had been off limits. No one had figured out how to package that in a small form factor, even though it was still too large and had these issues of these shimming and these space planes. It was still effective and worked extremely well. So that was a major step forward in the sense that we were able to develop a foot that could change its stiffness from step to step. And then we've since modified that design to make it very compact. And I believe that prosthesis has real potential to change people's lives because it's light and effective, and changes properties for different activities. It does a lot of the things we want a prosthesis to do. It doesn't add energy into you, so that's one downside, but it kind of does everything else pretty well. So I do believe it's only a matter of time before that foot is commercialized. It's really amazing, but we have to make it smaller and more compact before that'll happen, and that's what we're doing.
We are looking forward to that, right? On probably on our next podcast. So you said something about the open source leg project, right? Was a groundbreaking one because you released both hardware control system. So what were the hardest control challenges you faced in creating a modular prosthetics and that works across different geared styles? Yeah,
that was a great question. So you're talking about the open source leg project, which is a ecosystem of hardware and software tools to facilitate the development of robotic prosthetic legs. That came from the challenge that building a robotic prosthetic leg is incredibly expensive and difficult. So it makes it, if you want people to study these systems and build these control strategies, that can happen if hardware and software are kind of off limits to people. So we decided to make an open hardware and software platform. We've had a ton of support from the U.S. National Science Foundation, which really enabled us to make strides in this project. So we've been working on this for maybe 7 years. So your question was about the control. So this is a hardware and software platform to facilitate the control of prostheses. And maybe your question was like, what was the hardest thing?
Yeah.
But let me flip that and answer what was the easiest thing, or what was I like surprised by how easy it was. And this is awesome. So we have this like robot hardware. It has low level control sorted. So all you have to do is kind of interact and provide it a higher level control strategy, which is the point of the research. So we have researchers developing these control strategies around the world, and we wanted a way to share those to each other. So I could run yours and you could run mine, but a lot of people don't want to share the source code. They don't want to share exactly what's going on, for this, that's theirs. A lot of researchers are hesitant to give that away. So we developed a method to share the controllers while just sharing what's called shared object. So a compiled version of the source code. So we can share controllers now without actually sharing the source code, where we share compiled objects with inputs and outputs. And I can run your strategy, you can run mine, without actually having to share the source code. It sort of allows people to be open about their work and allow others to test it and compare against it, but it doesn't force people to give away what's inside maybe their special control strategy or something. So we had started the project. I didn't know about that as an option. I didn't know that we would be able to compile these cross-platform as shared objects. That was all new to me. My students and staff on the open source lag project, figured that out and then told me about it. And I think that's been really cool. So you can go on the website now, under control, you can find publicly accessible controllers. And those are, you could download after agreeing maybe to some license terms, you can download the controller, and there's instructions on how to run that controller on the hardware. So that's pretty cool. They do have different sensing requirements, as you might imagine, but luckily the platform is pretty extensible in terms of its sensing. So as long as that's documented, we feel like others can do it. So that's been pretty exciting. This shared object concept of transferring controllers between groups. And right now there's 2 people who have done it. Professor Greg at Michigan, and a group at Notre Dame, Pat Wensing and Juice Wheeler and others. So they released so we have 2 controllers available, one that's EMG based, one that's
Okay. So
based.
now in measuring so how do you balance between high fidelity modeling of human joints and the real world constraints of building devices people can actually wear daily?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure the answer to that is known, at this time. At this point, what we want to do is give people the ability to explore those questions. And then my personal take would be essentially math is the driving factor. So everything, if you do the analysis, everything eventually trades for mass. So the game is maximize performance while minimizing mass. And so everyone kind of has a different take on what that looks like, but that's kind of the game in the machine design world. And it's everything you can do to minimize mass and volume. And at this point, that's kind of the state of the field. That's especially true for exoskeletons, but even prostheses. Someone's missing their limb. We can take the volume and mass of that missing limb, and it should be relatively equivalent to that person. But the socket attachment, that's the way people wear a prosthesis, is through a cup-like structure that goes into a socket. So the residual limb goes into this cup-like structure. There's the socket, and that holds the prosthesis to the person. And that interface makes things feel very heavy. So even though it's lighter, typically even powered prostheses are lighter than the biological limb, which is essentially a giant bag of water. So it's heavy. So the prostheses are lighter than their biological counterparts, but they feel extremely heavy. And the reason for that is because of this socket attachment. we don't attach directly to the skeleton. And if you attach through the soft tissue of the skin and musculature, you don't feel that weight transfer to your skeleton the same way, and it feels very heavy. There is a up and coming procedure called osseointegration that can directly attach a prosthesis to the skeleton, and that changes the game in terms of mass. If it's attached to their skeleton, they don't feel the mass like they do when it's attached to their socket. So that's an upcoming concept that is still in kind of medical research, although it is done both in the US and around the world, that will change the game in terms of what the right, powered prosthetic solution is. Because right now, mass is the driving factor.
So now you talk about exoskeletons. Like, what engineering approach have you proven most effective in reducing user discomfort and increasing transparency of the control?
So this is a major area of research. This is like currently where a lot of people are doing their work, which is how to provide the control instructions to these systems, given that human motion is incredibly variable and that you have no direct access to the human neuromotor system. And so all of these systems, generally all of them, but for a few specific examples, all use the onboard sensors to do all of their control. So they don't receive any information from the wearer. It's all based on the sensors on the robot itself. So then the question is, how should they behave? And I can tell you two kind of general approaches. The way it used to be done and sort of the way it's done now. The way it used to be done, this is both for exoskeletons and prostheses, would be to break up life into a bunch of activities, cyclic activities: walking, standing, stair ascent, stair descent, ramp ascent, ramp descent, sidestepping, blah blah blah. Like a bunch. We could define a bunch of activities, and then we could say basically everything is some version of a mixing of these activities. That's historically then the approach, and it can work well. It doesn't work perfectly, as you could imagine. There's so many activities that are not cyclic or can break into those classes, but that's how it was done for decades and decades, pretty much from the 1980s to the 2020. So then what is the controller doing? It's looking for an activity class. So it's doing a giant classification problem. And then once it makes a classification, it has some understanding of, okay, if I'm going upstairs, I know that I do this. And if I'm walking, I know that I do this. And if I'm standing, I know I do this. So it has some state-dependent set of instructions based on a higher level activity recognition classifier. That worked well. That was the way it was done for a long time. As machine learning and compute capabilities have gotten more advanced, now there are what we would say is end-to-end approaches. So, not classifying based on activity, but instead going directly from sensor readings to assistance applied. And that has its own challenges, that idea. A lot of times those are based on giant neural networks. They have to have training data of some kind, and getting that training data is sort of its own question. There's differences between, there's massive open data sets of human biomechanics. There's a very small fraction of that as human biomechanics with a device. So there's some work in transferring existing data sets to device specific data sets. All of this would be to leverage these end-to-end modeling based approaches. We're beginning to look at reinforcement learning as a potential end-to-end approach. We have a couple different versions of that. I'm pretty excited about sim to real transfer. So that's developing the engineering of the robot in simulation and then porting that simulated hardware and control to the real world and having it be very similar, ideally, if it's been done well. So we're moving in some of that direction. We have control policies that are developed in simulation, and then we are about to export those onto device and try them in the real world. So that's sort of the newer approach, end to end, all machine learning, not really using these ideas of activities or classifying, which in some sense is a shame because there is information there. And it's true that we generally do the same things or many of the same things every day. So there's knowledge there that seems like would be good to take advantage of. But the current state of the art, the best we have is end to end. In fact, I would say Aaron Young at Georgia Tech has a control strategy that will predict the joint torque that would be expected given the motion that it's seeing. And they call this the biotorque controller. And that's excellent.
So the rehabilitation device rely heavily on adaptive controller. So how do you design a controller that not only adapts to user impairments, but also encourages recovery of natural function?
That's a great question. There are different approaches. Like we also, so the idea that people adapt when wearing these technologies, that's known and very important. So it is not yet clear what is the time scale of that adaptation and what is the ultimate, where's that adaptation going? All of that is still very unknown. Here is the way my group has been looking at this. So given that we now have access to these sophisticated wearable robots, prostheses and exoskeletons, the question of what they should do is, I think, on everyone's mind or very important. That experience of wearing a wearable robot is important and complex, and that we need to involve the user in the understanding of that experience so that we can foster an experience that they want or enjoy or is beneficial to them. So we've been studying user preferred settings. So what do users actually want from these systems, and how consistent are those wants over time or over activity? So we have looked at people's ability to find their preferred settings kind of in multiple dimensions. And we showed people are exceptional at finding their preferred settings, meaning they have a really strong internal signal of what is good or what they want from this device. So that's been illuminating and has been steering us into, answering these questions of what should it actually do? What is the right answer here? And then that's coupled with how do we get it to change and adjust and change for activity and adapt over time. There are certain machine learning approaches that allow for adaptation over time. And some of our approaches include that. And we're studying that or building it into our control pipeline there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the very answer. I believe there's a lot to be uncovered in robotics. So, but the little insight you shared, that was very helpful. So, also from an engineering perspective, so what role does actuator design play in advancing wearable robotics? Are soft actuators, quasi-passive systems, or traditional motors the most promising path forward?
Yes, that's a great question. And also like one of my hobbies / areas of interest,
Okay.
which is actuator design. The reason for that, I think, goes back to this concept of mass. So like, if we want to power a prosthesis, not only do we have to have a motor, but we have to have a transmission, because motors produce power in a regime that's not useful for human gait. So we have to scale the speed down and the torque up. So the system ends up being a motor and a transmission. So the actuator design part of that is all about minimizing that mass. How can we select an actuator or a motor and transmission combination that is not overly sized, it's not undersized, that's sort of just right, just right to maximize its use. So it should get warm, should even get maybe hot, but it shouldn't overheat. And so we do a lot of balancing all of these concepts and sizing to make actuators as small and as light as possible. And we have a lot of information on that. So we do both actuator design, so like the actual design of the motor and transmission combination, but then we also do a lot of like characterization. So how do we know if we have an actuator? Like, how do we know how well it's performing? And so we have like extensive kind of low level characterizations that we do. that help us know things like frequency response, how fast can the controller respond, if it's controlling position or torque or current or other things. And then we look at efficiency and test how energy is lost across the different torque speed regimes. But all of that goes into making a small and powerful actuator. That's all we're actually trying to do. So it's all about mass. And so we do so much to minimize mass. And so like that's where the actuator design comes from. We also do some other interesting actuator stuff that you would probably get a kick out of. But in robotics, especially kind of in maybe 10 years ago, there was this idea that you can do a motor, transmission, spring. So put those together and have a spring be the thing that interacts with the world, not the output of the transmission. Put a spring there. It's called a series elastic actuator. And so there's some really neat properties if you do that. So especially in robots that interact with people, you can design the properties of the robot to be more conducive to interacting with people, storing energy and returning it, et cetera, et cetera. But it adds mass, it adds volume. So we do some work into these types of actuators, designing lightweight springs, packaging those springs into the actuators that are small and light. And that's kind of fundamental mechanical engineering that we do. The springs we developed are actually really, really awesome. They're 2-part torsion springs. So they're a disc and a spring that rotates, and they are the smallest and lightest torsion springs in the literature that we could find. So that was pretty exciting, but it also is a beautiful spring. It looks sort of like a spirally star. So that's an open access publication on how to develop those torsion springs. And that came from this actuator work of developing lightweight, high performance actuators and springs.
So many prosthetic device like prosthetic device face durability. So and they face durability, they face cost barriers, right? So how does your lab approach the trade-off between cutting edge performance and also scaling it up, making it affordable, for mass adoption?
That is a great question. Durability is super important in the prosthetic world. It's actually like maybe one of the dominant design factors. There are specifications. If you want to sell a prosthesis in the United States, there are specifications that it has to meet. One of those is it has to run 2 million cycles without failure in a row. So they put it in a machine and run this for 2 million cycles. So that is an extremely high sort of durability barrier. We do concern ourselves with durability, not really for this ISO testing concept, but more for use in the lab and for research and for the students. The machines, our technology should be able to be used easily by students without having to worry about failures or robustness issues. So my team takes a little more time in the design of our technology to make that true, to make it, make sure the systems are robust. That being said, they probably couldn't go 2 million cycles. So that part of that we leave to the commercialization side. So if we develop a technology that we think is good, it's robust. We've done all of our kind of run it through all of our tests, and where we think it's ready, we would then translate it to a company who would take it on and sell it, and they would have to meet these ISO standards. And it's unclear to me how difficult that process would be. The durability is a really important factor of prosthetics. We focus on it to the extent that it's relevant to our research, but we don't over focus on it, and I kind of leave that to the commercialization partners. But that being said, that probably hinders the translation. If we took it on, the commercialization partners might be more likely to translate the technology. So maybe that is something we should take on, but historically we haven't. We've only made them robust to the extent that they need to work well for research. And that's kind of this divide between the research world of prosthetics, advanced prostheses, and the clinical world of advanced prostheses. And there's actually like a pretty huge gap between them. And that gap is narrowing, especially with researchers today, like paying more attention to what it is that they're building. But it's still a very large gap. In order to make a prosthesis able to be sold, it has to meet these robustness and durability specifications that are extremely aggressive. So that's a kind of ongoing area of research.